My name's George Beasley, and retired from Georgia State University, where I've taught sculpture for over 40 years. I'm still involved with the university. Went right to Georgia State from graduate school at Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, where coincidentally was the only sculpture studio in America pouring cast iron under the directorship of Julia Schmidt. And I became Schmidt's assistant. And my first introduction to the foundry was walking in, and this kind of gruff old guy with white hair sticking out all over the place, this isn't running, handed me a shovel. Not even said a word, here's a shovel. And found out that's the first tool you use in the foundry is the shovel. And we walked into a big iron pour. So I started pouring iron at Cranbrook. In 1966 that I first met Julius. The year he left, I was his last assistant there. What I saw at Cranbrook was the furnace was used as a kind of team activity. And I felt that if we had a furnace and everybody had to pitch in to make it work, it builds a team spirit, and we ended up with a really tight-knit group of students who learned to trust each other. If you're working with something dangerous and you realize that it might be the guy at the other end of the shank, might be somebody you just had an argument with, but now you're trusting with your life in a sense. It builds a kind of spirit and understanding of everybody. So that's what I incorporated into teaching. I felt it was important to teach by example, so I did, throughout my career, I did all my work in the studio at Georgia State, along with the students. I also provided free labor, which is kind of, hey, give me a hand with that, you know. So we did that, but then also I would do the same. I was often at the heavy end of the stick helping somebody else. So this kind of destroying elite kind of position is very important to me. We're all equal, we're working artists. Some are older and more experienced than others, but we're all coming from the same place, this desire to express ourselves through materials. And being a sculptor, I found I could do it best three-dimensional. And then drawing started coming into it more about 10 years after I started teaching. I started making drawings on the floor in chalk, figure out what I was doing. And then I thought, I wish I'd photographed that, because just swept it up. So then I started getting big sheets of just trash wrapping paper to draw on, because it wasn't important. I couldn't mess up a piece of scrappy paper. And finally started framing those, and one thing led to another, and I do quite a bit of drawing now. All that matters at the end is the image itself. And I also started playing around with furnace design and thought, what if you build a furnace out of the wrong stuff, such as sticks and twigs and mud and stone? And I started building these kind of primitive furnaces, some of them on legs and very high, like towers, out of branches of trees, and they would run one time before burning up, and sometimes I'd get maybe up to 1,000 pounds of iron out of it before the whole thing would burn down. So they became events. I like the word event better than performance. The making of art always involves a certain amount of performance, and if you're lucky, you get to hang around and see it. But blatantly, for me, doing performance, I find that pretty pretentious and boring. But yet I'm labeled as the first person to do iron performance work. It's spread all over the country. We have conferences now. In fact, it's spread around the world. Every art school in America of any size is running a big foundry. And it's based on those early furnaces that we started building. The show is. So I sign my name with an X. There's an X cast at almost every single performance event around the world, somewhere. It could be buried in the ground, it could be at the bottom of a lake. There's a lot of different places they exist. Some are very formal, such as the entrance to the garden at Tulane University. The picture of the furnace running that is in this show. That goes back to the first trip to Scotland. I had made arrangements with foundries to let me visit and possibly donate materials to the project we were doing in Northeast Scotland to build this new studio. I was always lost and ended up on this thing called the Cumbernauld Roundabout. I must have gone through the Cumbernauld Roundabout 30 times during that trip in the Central Belt. And that impression was in my mind when I went back to America and decided to do wall reliefs based on the roundabout and the landscape. Because there was always neat hills and valleys and stuff, but trapped in the roundabout. And that's one of the series from the Cumbernauld Roundabout. I call it Gary's piece because it was commissioned by a patron of mine, who's Gary Kaplan, who collected a lot of art in Atlanta. He's not with us anymore. He made it a point in the estate that it be returned to me. I didn't want it sold off. I'd be glad to sell it off. But anyhow. Now, my grandmother ran away from home with a young baby, an abusive situation, found work in Glasgow, made enough money to get to America. She was a very driven woman. She didn't mess around with Ellis Island. She was an illegal immigrant. She read the want ads in the paper and found a job in Ohio, went for it, ended up marrying the owner's son. So it was kind of a crazy thing, who then got inherited for marrying this savage immigrant lady. But I did learn that I did go back with many generations of foundry workers. And my first ancestors started in the 1700s. My great-grandfather is buried in Falkirk Cemetery, right below a foundry, iron line foundry above it. I found out all about this after going to graduate school, because my granny wouldn't say anything about it. When she came to America, that was it. She was done with Scotland. So, as many immigrants are, she knew she was never going back, and she didn't want to bring up the subject. Artists are always kind of an outsider, don't fit in, but usually the honored guest at an event. It's kind of console students all the time about this, where they're kind of in the studio looking sad and say, oh, I just don't belong, I don't want to stay in school, I don't belong here, I can't pass my course test and all that stuff. I said, well, you're probably an artist then. You're thinking dimensionally, you're not maybe doing so well with writing, but what do you do with your head and your hands? The patrons I've met introduces me. People who bought my work usually are on a whole different strata of society than I am, and yet I'm an artist, so we're invited in, but don't expect to join the club. You can just come for the club dinner, you know. But it's a passport. It's a passport culturally to be an artist. And you can fit in, you can travel through other people's cultures, and when they find out that you're a cultural searcher, then you're welcomed in, you know. And I found that in many different countries, and where there's a language barrier, we show pictures and there's understanding right away. I found that oftentimes students feel out of place in the university who are maybe dyslexic as I am, don't quite fit into the general university style student, feeling like they don't belong as an outsider. And at that point, I usually say, yeah, you are an outsider. If you're an artist, you probably will be. Embrace it, because it's the ticket to the world. You know, artists could go anywhere. Through the credibility of your work, you're going to meet all kinds of different people who are fascinated by what you're trying to do, and just be true to what you're trying to do. Oh, and be a little skeptical of your teachers. I really worried about one teacher back in my undergraduate school, and was doing terrible, and it was affecting everything else. It was actually a drawing teacher, a class, and then I finally made it into the next year, and the next drawing teacher looked at my feeble efforts, and I said, I just can't draw. I'm giving it up. I'm terrible at this. He said, oh, you can draw. And he just took my hand. He said, okay, make a mark on the paper. I made a mark on the paper. He said, that's a drawing. You just made a drawing. Make another mark on the paper, anywhere you want. And I started catching on. It's between you, the person, and that piece of paper and that bit of material. And the rules are guidelines that are out there, but they're not necessarily to be followed. You have to build your own matrix of rules and regulations, and then you start finding out who you are and where your imagery is taking you. Actually, that course was a life drawing class. And one of the little side stories is, here's this new model in front of me, and I couldn't draw the figures worth a damn at that time. But I was probably because I was looking past the naked lady to this beautiful set of legs behind a drawing board on the other side, who is now my wife, Judy. So we met in art school, got married at the end of art school, and she's been part of my work ever since. We worked together as artists. She's a ceramics artist, a potter, and a craftsman. And she works on my projects with me, and I'd fired all of her kills and did all that. So I do the labor for her. She does the intelligent legwork for me. That team works out pretty well.